All right, good afternoon, morning, evening, wherever you are. My name is Lady Isabetta Orsini. I am from the Kingdom of Ethelmark, the Barony of the Ridotto, which mundanely is Buffalo, New York. So welcome. It's sunny and shiny here. 3 days ago, we had 6 inches of snow. It's lovely. I don't know how it is in Venice, probably not snowing. So I'm here to talk about Venetian Carnival masks. We will do probably about the first 45 minutes because it always comes out differently on the history. And then I will show you the how-to that I did initially, and then kind of where I'm headed in the research that will probably make it easier and less hefty to carry around, which will be delightful. I'm so excited about that. So with that, we are going to hop over. If you did pick up the handouts, that's great. If you didn't, you will be fine. They are not mandatory, necessary, anything like that. I talk a lot. Enjoy, hopefully. And feel free to ask questions as we go. I apologize, my cat is busy treeing as many squirrels as possible. It's just a thing. He never catches them. He just likes to put them in trees. But they like to make a lot of noise because of it. All right, let's do slideshow. All right, so with that, we'll start with the history. And at the end, I will tell you kind of how I got interested in it, and there's a fun picture that goes with it. So, feel free to jump in anytime with questions. I really don't mind. I've given this a bunch online. I've given it at Penzic. I've given it a couple of times in person. Kind of got stalled out, whole pandemic thing. So Carnival was a time to have fun and let loose before the beginning of Lent. Carnival season actually ran from roughly December 26th through the beginning of Lent, though the citizens did not keep the celebrations to purely that time, and mask wearing kind of ran rampant throughout the year. 1094 was the first mention in writing of Carnival in Venice by Doge Vital Falier. And 1296 is the first recorded celebration of Carnival in Venice, where they actually kind of had a little more than just a mention. But there's quite a bit of time in there that they were probably having some fun. So I do a little bit of the etymology. A lot of the research talks about the etymology of the words that are involved in Carnival, so we will talk about them as well. Etymology of Carnival is farewell to flesh. The Latin carnivare or carnivarium, referring to the practice of not eating meat during Lent. And Carnival was a mythical vehicle used to transport the king of anarchy from one symbolic place to another, which is also something they did during Carnival, was to do a big boat trip with big fancy everything in Venice, which is they do something very similar today as well. So hopefully we can all go there someday and do that. The roots of Carnival, they think, so this is another highly contested idea. So it goes back to many different possible roots, possibly the Assyrians, the ancient Greek celebration of Dionysus, known as Bacchanalia, the Roman Saturnalia, the feast to honor Saturn, the pagan Liberalia, celebrating the arrival of spring and soil renewal, which would be kind of timing with the end of Carnival. And the other possible contributing origins were a couple other celebrations, which I might butcher the names, and I'm sorry. Lupercalia, Consulia, Palalia, Opalia, Venalia, and Genialia, just to name a few. All right, and so Liston was a parade of costumes and wealth taking place at the very beginning of Carnival. This was a time to kind of show off what you had, which is interesting because they also wanted to limit how much you showed off and had a lot of rules against showing off too much wealth. So Shrove Thursday and Shrove Tuesday celebrations, they held masquerades, bullfights, bull chases, and slaughters, which I am only imagining chasing if any of you have even seen pictures of Venice, chasing a bull down the narrow streets of Venice, up and over the bridges and everything. And this amuses me greatly. And yes. And then they also did gymnastic displays, bridge battles, which I think would be amazing in Venice, performances, dances, regattas, comedies, fireworks, and even semi-religious ceremonies held by the Doge. So the church did try to remain pertinent to Carnival in certain ways in order to maintain some kind of control. Not surprising. They didn't do a good job. Cacciatori or bull hunts, which took place throughout the city, were primarily held during Carnival time. But as you will see, nobles could get permission to do pretty much anything, but they could get permission for bull hunts at other times of the year as well. So a brief history of the Carnival in Venice. So the Venice Carnival has changed significantly in the course of its long history. Between the Renaissance and Enlightenment, Carnival represented aspects of politics, culture, and social behavior. From an aristocratic exhibition of individual wealth and power to an increasingly homogeneous masquerade that concealed the gap between patricians and citizens. From a rigidly controlled state spectacle in praise of the city's apotheosis to a libertine festival in the wake of the city's decadence. So it definitely made some changes from when it started in the very beginning and until when it became kind of a very flashy and show everything off affair. And you will kind of see that as we progress. So as with anything in those times, there was a discourse against it, not surprisingly anonymous, actually. So in masking the face, one also covers the conscience. Carnival made people act in ways they were otherwise not permitted. For example, dancing like a fool, a lady venturing out alone in public, a widow amongst revelers, all under the guise that Carnival allows it. Thus, mask wearing incited corruption. So this is a theme that you will see kind of all throughout. It did actually allow people to kind of do things that they weren't otherwise allowed. And it kind of seems an interesting way to get around the rules, for sure. That won't work if I'm on there. There we go. So mask wearing in general. So Signora Maschera, which technically translates to Lady Mask, was a acceptable greeting for anyone, any costumed person. So you could greet anyone that way. Masks were seen as a great equalizer. So the rich and the poor, casino owners and patrons or gamblers, and peasants and nobles. Masks were not actually considered luxury items. They were kind of just like having, head coverings or shoes. They were kind of in most of the homes from what I understand, although I'm kind of working on seeing how true that is by going through dowries and things like that. So masks were actually worn in Venice up to 6 months a year and possibly more. So they were definitely allowed to begin on December 26th, ending on Cinere or Ash Wednesday. Mask wearing, but then they go in to say like mask wearing was forbidden during Lent, 10 days prior to Christmas and on certain holidays. However, licenses could be granted for mask use all the way until October 1st. So that's way more than 6 months a year. So if you had the money, you could do it. In fact, it was not uncommon for fetes and mask balls to be held during Lent and the 15 days of the Festa della Senza or Ascension Day. So you can see it's kind of, if you could afford it, you could do it. Masks were worn in many environments, not just for revelry and frivolity, but they were also worn to operas, cafes, state ceremonies, and receptions, for example. This included casinos, where whether you won or lost was dependent on the sharpness of your wit, how well you judged your opponent, and the whim of fortune, who smiled on all differently. So in this way, rank held no sway. And casinos were pretty popular there. In the casino, you could find a mix of Jews, merchants, prostitutes, nobles, patricians, foreign diplomats, and vagabonds, which was not something you would see generally in other places. So the masks also allowed courtesans to do business, homosexuals to hide their illegal activities, nuns and women, also women, to engage in sexual activity unrestrained. So, and we will touch on that later as well. Occasionally masks were used in mock procession, imitating those in power. Many masqueraders used masks to identify themselves, at least in part, with their social opposites. So for example, nobles would dress as peasants, harlots as men, men as women, populace as officials, old as young, etc., which led to some of the attempts at legislation, because you can imagine the nobles did not particularly like being imitated or mocked. And they also didn't like, the harlots dressing as rich women. So Il Ridotto was one of the Venice casinos where all except the banker were meant to be masked. And I know this is a teeny tiny picture and you really can't actually, there aren't very many really good images of it, but there are quite a few masked people in this image wearing a Bauta or Larva mask, which we will talk about later. This is actually a later period image, but it's pretty neat to see how many people in the picture are actually wearing a mask. So gambling, like mask wearing, was the great equalizer, like we said. The rules applied equally, unlike everyday life in Venice. It created as a result laws allowing nobles to partake in gambling at home. And as such, Marco Dandolo received permission to hold private gambling in his large palazzo close to San Moise, thus beginning Il Ridotto, which is this particular casino. And this poem was written about Il Ridotto. So this is where they come to wager: ducats, sequins, silver, gold. It has no equals, none can match its splendid air or noble mold. A sculpted goddess in the foyer keeps stately vigil night and day. At the threshold stands a gambler with mask in hand and keen to play. Mask legislation. So mask legislation, much of what we actually know or presume to know about masking in Venice is due to the legislation that survived. So unfortunately, much of the actual history has been destroyed. The writings about it has been destroyed. However, the legislation has made it because it was written into books about all the legislation. So they didn't just rip out, one law and say, okay, well, it has to do with masks, let's get rid of it. So historians are able to infer that mask wearing was not largely popular prior to 1268, as regulations would have emerged earlier. So we are able to infer the levels of moral decadence of the era to which masks contributed greatly based on the laws created in an attempt to rein in that behavior. Mask wearing allowed anonymity to those committing bogus crimes, thus leading to the creation of the laws. So while many laws enacted intended to limit the behavior of mask wearers, these laws were, for the large part, ignored. So they get, you will see as we go through the legislation that has survived, that it's repeated a lot. So we're just going to quickly go through some of the mask legislation. The law in 1268 was the very first law, and it's a law that forbade mask use in a street game known as ova or gioco dell'ova, and that's actually what is pictured in that picture over there. It was a game in which the mask wearers would dress up, and there was some of the pictures are actually very similar to Harlequin costumes, the checkered or the diamond jester type costumes that we've seen historically. And they would wear masks and they would take eggs that they had emptied and then filled with scented water, so rose water or something like that, and they would throw them at the people passing by. Well, this was all well and good as long as you were filling it with rose water. However, people didn't even really love being rose watered, but they sometimes were not so kind in what they filled the eggs with, which did result in some areas where the richer women with the very gorgeous gowns, they actually put netting over to try and protect them from getting egged, essentially rose watered, not rose watered, with stinky eggs. So it did actually make some changes. So you can see that that was probably actually pretty important. So they were trying to basically say, like, you can't wear a mask if you're going to do this because you're going to get in trouble for it. Because without the mask on, we would know who you are and we will find you. So then the next law was 1339, forbidding night raids by mask wearers. So again, you know, basically you can't do bad stuff and get away with it because you're wearing a mask. In 1436, there was a law that reorganized the arts magistrates, which impacted the mask makers organization. In 1443, a law against men dressing as women, and they would typically wear a specific mask, which again, we will talk about as we progress. In 1444, a law reiterating current prohibitions, emphasizing laws against women disguised or with their heads covered. So they were trying to also limit the women going out disguised and by themselves. So that was a big issue as well. In 1458, there was a law prohibiting men dressed as women from entering monasteries. This was actually an interesting thing I learned during the first time I taught at Penzic, because I did not understand that. It has to do with inheritance law and the fact that at the time, many women were pushed into monasteries by their families, not because they wanted to serve God. And so there were women that were not as devoted to God necessarily as, you know, they would otherwise be. And so they were plenty open to the idea of having male visitors in the monasteries. So the male visitors would sneak in dressed as women and have fun with the women in the monastery who didn't otherwise want to be there. And so this is hence the law prohibiting men dressed as women from entering monasteries. So that was a little fun tidbit I learned at Penzic, which is, you know, good place to learn it, I guess. In 1461, there were serious fines imposed for men in masks who threatened others. So we can see already a trend going towards issues with men in masks committing violence against others. In 1463, the creation of the actual Mask Makers Guild. In 1467, further laws regarding masked men from entering monasteries, another thing that becomes a big issue. In 1502, the law took a stand against masked men running around town carrying weapons, and it said, for example, guns and sticks. In 1504, they reiterated many of the prohibitions already listed. This is a pretty long list, I'm sorry, hang with me. It's not too bad, but in 1531, a new decree forbidding use of weapons by or on people in masks. In 1546, plague masks are prohibited, but no one knows how well this law is observed. However, I was kind of trying to figure out exactly what this meant, and there are two kind of interpretations, and one is that masks were prohibited during the time of the plague, so you were not supposed to wear them in order to get around town, which is a different interpretation. So basically, while the plague was going on in Venice, you could not wear masks. The other interpretation is that you were not allowed to wear a mask similar to the plague doctor masks, which I have found some information that they may have emerged. Similar masks to the one that we know as the plague doctor mask has emerged earlier. And you were not allowed to wear that style of mask during this time because that was supposed to be restricted to just the plague doctors. I'm still working out which one is which. Both would make sense. But unfortunately, I don't read ancient or old Italian, and I'm not able to, this book is not, or the legislation is not easily available online, and I'm working on it. It's one little tidbit. So 1585 is further prohibition of masked individuals carrying weapons or other dangerous tools. It's an issue. 1590 reiterates same prohibitions and also forbade masked people from using whips on coachmen. So that would be a big issue if you were actually using a coachman in Venice and someone whipped the coachman. That could be extremely dangerous in the limited space in Venice. If the coachman or the horse or whatever was or got spooked, that would be a major problem. In 1593, prohibits masked men from bearing arms, period. 1603, repeating ban on masked men talking to nuns, still a problem. In 1604, a law threatening confiscation of clothes deemed to be too elegant, made of materials that are too expensive, as this was prohibited expressly by law. So this is where you start to see people using masks as a way of, well, I'm wearing a mask, so it's obviously not me that's wearing these fantastic clothes. And it was a way of skirting the specific laws about elegant clothing. And there were veils that went along with the masks to kind of hide the elegance, but they were see-through and you could still see it. So 1605 prohibits masked individuals from using weapons. You can see these were really effective no matter how many times you did it. This is the last few ones. So 1606, masked people were not allowed in the places of worship. So you have to infer that earlier they were generally allowed. They did have times before that where they talked about specific ceremonies in which masks were worn into churches. In 1607, renewing the prohibition of carrying weapons while masked. In 1608, the Council of Ten, or Consiglieri del 10, issued a decree beginning to limit the times of year when masks could be worn. Masks including fake beards or mustaches, other fabric covering the face, limited to citizen nobles or strangers on ground or boat. So this is actually where you start to see the limitations taking place as the government in Venice starts to change. And these are changes that became more permanent, eventually ending the wearing of masks overall. So in 1613, they repeat the 1608 decree with the same prohibitions and penalties. In 1615, there was a law forbidding prostitutes from using boats and wearing masks. In 1618, there was further magistrate action against masked men or women with clothes deemed to be too luxurious. And in 1628, the Senate called for the Council of Ten to take action against masked men gambling and take under its full jurisdiction all matters relating to games and masks. So laws actually continued to be enacted concerning masking until 1797, when wearing masks was banned except in private residences. And then you can imagine as the government in Venice became increasingly restrictive up through World War II, most of the masks were actually destroyed. There are not very many extant pieces. There are no extant pieces to our period, but there are some that survived from the 1700s, I believe. And I have a picture of one, and I've found one more since then. But it's actually very difficult because I believe a lot of them were destroyed because the government was saying no masks at all. You can't have this. This is bad. And so people were not going to keep something that the government was saying was that bad. And they were not kind of doing the I can afford it, so you can't stop me thing anymore. So mask making as a profession. On April 10th, 1436, the Painters Guild reorganized in order to include the masquerari or masquerari and joined by the targeri. So masquerari were master craftsmen. Although first known mention of the group was in 1271, it was not until April 1436 that the mask makers were granted their own guild under the reign of Francesco Foscari. Just as an aside, a copy of the original paperwork creating the Mask Makers Guild is still kept in the Venice State Archives, so you can actually go see that. The Targeri were the mask makers of masks and face shields from paper mache. They were also, they were made, the cartellari were the card makers. The group remained largely autonomous, so the mask makers did until 1620 when it merged with that of illuminators, designers, gilders, and cartellari or card makers. So between 1530 and 1600, 11 new members joined the Painters Guild and Masquerari, including one woman, Barbara Scarpetta. They worked on volti or faces in fine waxed canvas or oilcloth or paper mache. And Tommaso Garzoni's essentially universal assembly of all the professions of the world, and noble and ignoble. In 1585, basically, he was not all about mask making. He did not like it. He portrayed masks as an evil invention, reminder of the biblical temptation of the serpent, as masks allowed or eased ill behaviors, such as pandering and whoring. He described masking as not a lighthearted game or source of cheer, nor a recreation for the mind and diversion of gentlemen. Masks distracted the mind and tempted the spirit to evil, as it was easier to end up in a whorehouse, masked, and gives one the confidence needed to talk to women and harlots alike. His dislike of masks also stemmed from the fact that masks violated and ignored the long-established social order. You can probably guess where he fell in the social order from that. Despite all the evils, he did recognize that masks did have a place in politics, as he felt that this allowed politicians and royalty to mingle with the public, thus observing their behavior, hearing their criticisms and praise, and gathering information secretly in order to better know how to correct themselves or their subjects in what is right. So, but he did say that for most Venetians, the desire to lose oneself was greater than the pull of morality. So the common types of masks, the etymology, here we go again, of the word masks, Latin mascus or masca, maschera in Italian, mask in French, mascara in Spanish, mask in German, mask in Swedish, maska in Danish. Also able to be traced to an earlier root, maska, from a word meaning soot or smut from before Indo-European languages. References frequently occurred with references to monsters or witches, and then evolved to mean mask. So the Bauta or Larva mask is the one, this one over here, or here. It's kind of the Bauta Larva Volto is kind of the whole outfit that you see this individual wearing there. Or National Mask of the Serene Republic. This one was the mask that hides all differences. And this is another one that's highly disputed, where they don't kind of really know where the origin lies. The one argument is for the German word behüten, meaning to protect, preserve, or defend. The Accademia del Crusca argues for Bacuccio or Bacuco, based on the prophet Habakkuk, meaning senility or bundled in clothes to protect against the cold. Tomasio thought it came from bow or non-voice used to frighten children. So I'm assuming that's something like boo, but Italian version. And Battaglia argued for the origin being bava or bavaglio, meaning a gag or mouth covering impeding speech, which is kind of interesting because this mask actually is the easiest to talk in, eat, drink, be merry, all those things. But you never know. So the etymology for larva, from largo or larvae, meaning a spectra or ghost, or to possess evil spirits, which is actually potentially for ghost might be correct, because if you could imagine someone walking down the street with just the white face and they would be wearing a black hat and black veil kind of covering, you could imagine that might actually look kind of ghostly in the dark in Venice at night. So potentially. The root word evolved to mean fiction, illusion, or false appearance, and from there evolved to describe masks. So the larva was the white mask used to conceal the wearer's identity. It could be in period, it was typically white or black, though more commonly white. And all the masks in period were white or black, typically white. So it wasn't until much later that they evolved into the fancy decorated ones that we see today. My best guess is, well, for one, they were wearing them for anonymity. So if you decorated your mask super fancy, there's Isabetta's mask. It's the one with the diamonds and the fancy stuff on it. Oh, there's a plain white mask. I have no idea whose plain white mask that is. I mean, that's still a little bit of pulling the leg because, you know, we can tell each other apart from how we walk and how we dress and how we do the things, but at least you could pretend a little bit because you couldn't see the face. So the bauta was actually the accessories typically worn with the mask. So a black cape paired with a tricorn hat and a close-fitting hood or mantle made of lace, velvet, or satin that typically allowed others to see the ostentatious clothing and jewelry worn underneath, which was usually outlawed by the sumptuary laws previously addressed. So there were quite strict sumptuary laws. However, if you were rich, you could just say, okay, I'll pay the fine, but I'm going to wear what I'm going to wear. But if you were wearing a mask and the veil, you were technically not known who you were. And, you know, you weren't doing anything wrong because you had the mask on. So you were invisible to the law, essentially. So this outfit was actually worn by men or women, allowed the wearers to eat and drink and breathe freely while remaining hidden, which is a really neat thing about this mask, and it's why it's one of my favorites. This mask was very common and became known as standard dress, especially amongst nobility, which then commoners also used it, though typically the outfit was adapted amongst the commoners. For example, perhaps they didn't have the lace hood or the cap, thus meeting the minimum requirements for disguise. So they might just have the mask or, you know, portions of it. So marriageable women were forbidden from wearing this getup, though again, this meant primarily unheated. So use of this mask was typically permitted outside of just carnival time. Oh my goodness. So I actually have one that was made commercially. So this one's actually plastic-ish, something. Very hard. Whereas the ones, as we'll discuss later when we get into the making, are not that way. But I want to show you why it is that I think this mask is so cool. I'm going to take my glasses off because it makes a difference. But so you can actually eat, drink, do all the things down here, and it's fine. The other thing is, in terms of anonymity, it does actually change your voice a little bit, which I thought was really neat. So, it is, the way they would make them in period, to my understanding, is that they would be a little bit flexible. So they would actually fit your face a little better, typically. And if you were rich enough, you could obviously get one that molded to your face better than that.
Isabetta, we have a question.
Absolutely.
Luciano is wondering, have you found evidence of the larva with the black bauta and the lace, the pre-1600? I guess because the images you have here are both post.
They talk about it pre-1600. There are not a lot of images of masks at all pre-1600, but I know that there were, like there's the laws about them and there's discussion of them in the literature, but there isn't, there just aren't a lot of the pictures that around. So most of my pictures are around 1600, some from the 1500-ish, but I will tell you that it is kind of difficult to find the pictures. I'm in the process of finding all the Italian words for the fancy things so that I can search Italian websites, even though, you know, most of it's Google Translate. Sadly, I do not speak enough Italian to do all the things, but
I know your pain.
But there is evidence that it was worn before then. It gained popularity and became the most popular mask around the 1600s into the 1700s. So
we have evidence of the mask. Do we have evidence of the like black lace cover and everything?
I don't know, to be honest. Yeah, the mask for sure, the black lace cover, not 100% sure about that. But they do talk about the Bauta, which is the whole kind of get up thing beforehand. So part of the problem is that a lot of people who have done kind of minimal research and talk about it mix the Bauta Larva Volto into kind of one thing, and then they'll say it as it kind of one thing, and then they'll talk about it pre-1600, but then you don't know if they really mean that. It gets very confused, and it's a lot harder to kind of piece out, well, it seems like you did your research because you've got some really good sources, but is that piece of information really good? Or so I've done a lot of like comparisons and trying to piece it out. So to be 100% honest, I am not 100% sure. Sorry. I apologize.
Luciano says thank you.
You're welcome. All right, so it shows up here. All right, so the masks, the domino mask or the half mask. So like I said, a lot of my images are going to be roughly 1642 because Bertelli was one of the first people to actually do a lot of the images that were clear enough to see and kept. Because he did like a whole, his prints were made into books and they were kept, maybe not in Venice, I don't know. Part of the problem is there's just not a lot. And I think it has to do with the whole, they got outlawed and that was a problem in Venice at the time. So the mask in Domino is the half mask worn with a hood rather than a cape and a hat. So, so the etymology was French for cloaks worn by monks, known as Benedicamus Domino, which meant bless the Lord. So again, like there just weren't pictures, which makes me super sad. And I go on and try every once in a while. And I actually think if I go try now, there might be more because people in museums have had like a whole year of not as much busy time, which is also sad but exciting for me because I did actually find another mask that survived from the 1700s, which is exciting because there aren't very many masks at all. So that survived from any time period. So, all right, so this mask is the Moretta or Muta mask. Again, pictures from later, but this mask is a small oval-shaped black velvet mask held in place by a button or bead in the mouth. The one on the left is actually one someone made more recently, and it doesn't have the velvet. It's just a black painted one. But they were typically, the ones that I've read about were velvet or some kind of cloth on the front. These were primarily worn by women, and they were held in place by a button, so you could not typically talk with them. Many times they were worn with a mantle that allowed the sumptuous clothing again underneath to be seen. So Again, kind of, I can get away with it if I'm wearing a mask. So these actually, for me, when I first saw them, I was kind of horrified in my very 21st century kind of way, like, oh, but they can't talk and it's horrible. But then when you read about them, they were actually seen as kind of an erotic attraction in the highly sexualized world in Venice, because while wearing this mask, the woman remained semi-anonymous and mute or quiet until she wished to respond to any advances, at which time the man both heard her voice and saw her face for the first time. So the button allowed for quick unveiling of expressions and intentions. That made it a little better for me in some ways. So this mask we actually touched on earlier, but you didn't know it. This is the Gnaga mask, or a form of the Gnaga mask. This image is not a period image. It's a later image of one that was made in reproduction. The etymology is, first of all, this mask was typically worn by men dressing as women. It covered roughly half the face, half or 2/3 of the face, and was a half mask, typically made of paper mache. And it was made to resemble either a cat or a pig muzzle. So this one's more on the pig line-ish. The etymology was gna or meow of a cat, due to the wearer's tendency to provoke passers-by with lewd language in a harsh voice, making them sound like cats, which in Venetian at the time, these cats said gnau instead of meow. So the outfit included masks and ladies' common dress, and sometimes also a basket full of kittens. So those poor innocent kittens. The individual wearing the Gnaga mask was frequently accompanied by friends dressed as tati or tata, which was babies, to whom the Gnaga played as nannies. So it was a whole kind of performance. The Gnaga mask was originally created to help men dress as women in a climate where effeminate behavior was frowned upon, and thus thought to contribute to a rise in homosexuality, for which the punishment at the time was hanging. So this was kind of the workaround for being able to act in a somewhat more effeminate manner without getting hung. So while wearing the Gnaga, a homosexual could be more open due to anonymity, like any other masked person, as he was wearing a mask to act out a role. A masked person would not be arrested, no matter how strange their behavior, as they were viewed to be only playing a role. That is, unless they demonstrated dangerous or violent behavior. So just to give you an idea of why the law was so interested in forbidding homosexual behavior at the time. In 1500, there were 15,000 female prostitutes in Venice at the time. And there were more male prostitutes beating them out. And the population wavered between 50 and 140,000 people. So that was a pretty large percentage of the population making their money via prostitution. So in 1508, the female prostitutes actually appeared before the bishop, complaining about the lack of customers due to the popularity of the male prostitutes and homosexual encounters. Resultantly, in order to encourage heterosexual couplings, the bishop went to the government and they ruled to allow women to display themselves half naked in their windows as an advertisement. So, yeah, interesting kind of trickle up of laws. All right, so this is the Mattasin mask, or Mattacino. This is the mask documented in the earliest mask law from 1268 that they wore typically on their egg throwing journeys. It was typically worn with a bright collared costume, which could be worn with or without the mask, as anonymity was typically not important. So this mask was, this was the kind of the jester type mask. And the Mattasin actually ended up becoming a popular representation in Commedia dell'arte, which means that it basically transitioned from everyday use for Venetians into Commedia dell'arte performances. And this is because that gesture-like over-the-top behavior kind of really embodied the typical Venetian society. So made a good transition there. So another common type of mask, though it's not perfectly represented in either of these images, but it's they talk about it as the Spiriti Folletti mask, which was more of a traditional Venetian zendale, which was kind of the cloak kind of look, tied at the waist though, and then worn about the head in order to make a spirit-like costume decorated with colored ribbons. So this is one of those things that's hard to find images of, but they do talk about it more as like a method of kind of doing something a little more fun and different. The poor women would do the same thing using a scarf, also known as a ninzioletto, worn around the neck with two corners twisted up and standing up like horns. So that's why I included this image, although in closer looking at it, it kind of looks like that might be her hair, which is another fun hairstyle. And the wearers would run around the streets shrieking in order to scare passersby, hence the name. So again, they use the zendale to cover up fancy clothing. So I just do a quick one quick thing about the Commedia dell'arte masks. They emerged in roughly the 1500s. I have not done a ton of research on them. I only touch on them because I typically, if I don't, I get questions about them at the end. And I do like to at least acknowledge that I know they existed because they were a big thing in Venice at the time. Excuse me. So they were not frequently worn by common citizens, as these masks were considered to be for the stage only. And they continued to be worn by mummery, so for performance purposes, long after regular mask wearing was outlawed, and they continue to be worn today. They were usually made of leather in order to withstand the many hours, days, and years of usage on stage. So paper mache and material would not hold up to the hours of on stage and sweating and heat and everything like that. So they were made of leather, and those will withstand much more usage and everything like that. So in other words, so these were some of the typical masks. The Commedia dell'arte masks had very specific characters that they were made to reenact. The plague doctor mask, the one that we know today, was believed to be French in origin and created by Dr. Charles Delorme in the 16th century. And there were only two known methods at the time to ward off the plague, which were building votary temples and sanitary organization, which was limited by the lack of medical knowledge at the time. So there are, however, 14th century medical texts that recommended special dress by doctors treating diseases, and it included a mask in it with special scents in the nose piece. So that would imply that there was something similar to this mask prior to the official one that we know of today. So the end of mask wearing. So just to touch on something, although out of our period, you'll forgive me for a second. So with the downfall of the Serene Republic in July of 1797, many of the traditions and knowledge relating to masks disappeared and was destroyed. So only limited information remains from obscure volumes For example, the laws, so you can piece out from each law going through year by year. Oh, I found one related to masks. Let me keep reading. 20 years later, I found another one. So many of the works were burnt during or shortly after the invasion of Venice. So again, very hard to find things. And you have to forgive me for pulling things from all over the place. Masks were outlawed except within private residences at that time. In the 1930s, the fascist dictatorship completely outlawed even private balls that had been permitted during the downfall of the Serene Republic. So if you can imagine how terrifying it would be in the 1930s to have something completely outlawed, maybe you had been holding on to a family heirloom that had survived since 1797. Perhaps at that time you got rid of it or buried it or burnt it, and thus the incredible paucity of information. In the 1980s, however, Carnival was resurrected in response to the end of the era of tyranny and terrorism beforehand. So it kind of just came back, and then they decided, hey, why would we wear plain white? And we will do everything fancy and fun and decorated. And now we have all the super fun and interesting and amazing masks. So now you can attend Carnival fully masked and costumed, though I would warn you that the current laws are much more likely to be enforced. So this is actually a mask from 1750 that survived. So it's just shortly before the fall of the Serene Republic. You can see it was a probably duck canvas, something like that. And you can see the front and the back. It was a black, so this would have been a Bauta larva mask. And I found one more that was white, and I will include it in my thing next time. So how I got into this was one of my local barony had an event, and the theme was a big, like a puppet, what was it? Parade. There we go. Large puppet parade. And our barony symbol is a dragon. And I started out to build a gold dragon, and it turned into a yellow chicken because I ran out of time. And so I ran out of time, but I also at the same time wanted to make some masks because there was just going to be an A&S display, and that wasn't terribly terrifying because I could do an A&S display and not an A&S contest. So I made the masks in a method that I thought might be similar, but I hadn't done a ton of research, enough that I knew that they were plain white, which was super exciting because I didn't have to decorate them. So I made those masks, as you can see above, along with the yellow chicken, which took up most of my time because you can see that's a human being inside the yellow chicken, and it was big. It was really big and yellow, very, very yellow. And my baroness tried to convince me I was going to keep it. I do not still have it. I am sure the garbage man that took it has nightmares about it still. That's okay. So when the first masks I made, I will tell you that the spatial concepts for the larva mask are not easy for me for some reason. So the first one I made, it's angled down. I did not get the whole squaring off thing or the out because I didn't look at a bunch. And again, I was very tired from making yellow chicken. And it came out like this. I did it with, based off of I had just a regular mask. And I used that as my base and like for the eye, like how to measure the eyes and everything. And I just kind of did that. There were a lot of errors in this one, but I did it with paper mache, and then I did one layer of canvas or muslin to try and strengthen it out because I thought they were really strong. As it turns out, they make them rather flexible, typically, so that there's a little bit of give because that is much more comfortable on your face. But that is something you find out when you do a little more research than you do when you're making a big yellow chicken in 3 masks. And this is not flexible at all, and it is rock hard. So I actually originally gave away all of the masks I made very generously when I started teaching two of the masks came back to me so that I could teach about them and what I did initially, because they were basically sitting in someone's basement because they're not really wearable. They're incredibly hard and very, like in the back, you can see all the lines. And I did modern gesso on them because it says that they were covered in gesso, but they're covered in something that is period gesso, not modern cracking, like it cracked up there. So we'll go away from those for now. So as I did more research, I learned that they basically would make a positive, which was interesting because I had never worked in clay before. But so they would do a positive. And so I started working on that. And so you start with like, you know, okay, I need to learn to work in clay. So I did that on the left. And then I thought, okay, this is fine. I did that. And I started using, I used a half a mannequin head because the clay is very heavy and it's not inexpensive. And so there is a half a mannequin head behind that amount of clay in the middle, which is human face sized for very large men, because I just had a concept issue and kept adding on to try and make it look like the actual mask. The first one came out really big, but essentially I used half a mannequin head and then added on to it to create that. And I actually think that's the one that's close to. Sorry, I'm trying to grab it and it's stuck behind the. So essentially created this in the positive. But since I was new to clay, I thought that middle one was nice and smooth. And my friend who was teaching me clay came and told me no, and she helped me fix it. And then you take your positive, and we were doing it, we did it in a box in order to create our negative. So you set your positive down in the box, and the one in the white is a mask and domino, and then you see two different ones for the larva mask. I have created a few different positives for the larva and two different ones for the mask and domino. With the idea being that I would take them and people would be able to create masks in a class in person. And we will talk about how that went. So then you mix up your plaster of Paris, use slightly warmish water, otherwise your hands will freeze. And you pour it over your mask, which remember to put on some kind of release agent. That is actually super duper important. But this stage you can actually use olive oil. It will be okay. And it will be fine. However, my one warning is if it is not secured really well to the bottom of the box, something really freaky will happen. So the mask and domino in the red, we poured all the white into the box, and all of a sudden the red mask came floating up because it was not secured. And I jumped super high, which gave my friend the best laugh of her life because it looked like an alien rising from the goo. It was fantastic. And then she very quickly, because she is very used to this kind of thing happening, we grabbed pencils, put the thing back down in and jabbed pencils in at an angle in order to make it so that we would no longer have an alien rising from the goo and we could still use the plaster of Paris we had already put in there. And then from then on, we just went ahead and used angled pencils in order to keep them at the bottom of the box, which does make it a little harder to get it out of the mold, out of the box at the end, but was very worth it because when they come rising out of the goo, it's not that fun. Hilarious the first time to people that aren't scared of aliens rising from the goo. All right, so This is the very first one. I was coming dangerously close to the first time I was going to teach this class, and I was freaking out, and it took a really long time to dry. And my first one, we used, I want to say 32 pounds of plaster. That's a lot of plaster. And the first one, we had a little bit of an issue getting it out. We had to carve out a little bit. And so this is all the white is what I had to fix in order to be able to use the positive again. But we got it out finally. This is what it looked like when it came out of the box, because this part was at the bottom. And we managed to finally get all the clay out without completely destroying the positive. You look very confused. No, you're good? Okay. And if anyone has questions about any of this, please feel free to ask. I know it's kind of confusing on this way, but I'm trying to describe it. So we peeled away the box, and then we tried to get the clay out as best we could. It took a little bit, so we just like the edges of the clay got destroyed, and then I very purposely used white clay in order to be able to show what was destroyed, just as like kind of a, hey, this was the problem. Like this is where we had issues. So then you can see that. I think this is not the same one, but you can see on this side what got destroyed. We also had to dig out quite a bit of the styrofoam. So then we ended up filling it with great stuff, which is fantastic and weird, but it worked out. And then you can see the actual negative mold there, and I will show you one here. Now that one is the 32-pound one, and that was the original one, which is very heavy. And this one is only about 24 pounds, which is still heavy, but it's like, you know, that's lighter, and that's good. So this is what you use. And then here's that one doesn't have pencil holes in it. So this one is the mask in Domino. Whoop, it's upside down. Here we go. And you can actually see right there is one of the pencil holes that you use to hold it in when you don't want it to float up like an alien. And so there is one that's still in the storage space that still has a pencil like embedded in it, but it's not sticking out or anything. We just couldn't get the pencil out of the plaster. Too much moisture absorbed into it. And so it's still in there, but it's not in the mask area. It's outside the mask area. So we just left it there. And don't wear black when you're working with plaster, by the way. It's not the smartest choice. But so here I was, and I finally created this, and I was so excited. And I got the super special paper. So let's see. Okay. Applying the paper. So we're going to pause here. And this is actually a friend at a class that I taught, and she was the only one it was a very small thing, and the only one person came, so she let me take a lot of pictures of her applying stuff. The paper is a very special paper. It's called wool paper, and it does actually look like it has little wool fibers in it. It is what they use in Venice right now, and when you go to the mask makers pages, they say this is what was always used. There's no proof. Like they don't provide any proof because they don't want you to make it yourself. You can go to Venice and buy it. That's pricey way to get it, but it's actually not exactly cheap anyway, to be honest, because you have to import it because there is nowhere in America that has it. And then so I imported some of it from England, and I was super excited. It is soft and it tears quietly. And I went to go look for my stash of it today. And I have one big box that's 40 pounds of it, and I will tell you how I got that. But then I have like a small stash of it, and I cannot find the small stash anywhere. It is hidden. I don't know where it went because I was going to show you. But it's gray and it's amazing. And when you wet it down, it is just this very interesting, very flexible, works really well, goes into all the bumps and creases stuff. and it's fantastic. Well, so I bought the first stuff, and then I think I bought one other round. And then the next time when I was going to be starting teaching more, and I wanted people to be able to make the masks, I went to buy it, and I'm looking at the website and I'm putting my address in, and USA was not an option. Well, it turns out you can't actually ship it to the USA anymore because the shipping law has changed and you couldn't ship this kind of wool paper to the USA. So I happen to live at the border of Canada and have Canadian friends in the SCA. So I shipped 40 pounds of paper to my Canadian friend in the USA. And I wasn't exactly clear. I just said, can I ship something to your house from England? And he said, sure, he didn't care. And then when he brought it to me, he goes, what did you buy? It's like this big by this big and 40 pounds. And I said, oh, it's paper. And he's like, okay, why? It's wool. Oh, okay. And he was fine with that. But he was kind of weirded out initially because he's carrying this big heavy box of something. And it got shipped to his house, but that's fine. So I got the wool paper and it's delightful. And if you ever get the chance to work with it, it's fantastic, but you might have an issue getting it. So the first thing is the release. And I don't know if I actually have pictures of the first time I tried to release, and I tried to use olive oil because it was period and we thought it would work. It does not work. It just seeps right into the paper mache and it does horrible things when you try to pull it out. It just is awful. I'm not sure I included the pictures later on or not. And I ended up using Vaseline, which is not period, and I'm working on a couple different period release possibilities now. So this one is Vaseline, and she applied it, and we did, I think, 2 layers. So we did one horizontally and one vertically. I have since found out that 3 is probably a better standard. So horizontally, vertically, and kind of haphazard, like a diagonal or something like that. And talking to someone who does masks, a semi-traditional method, but does non-traditional, really beautiful masks, and was actually willing to talk to me. Because the mask makers in Italy don't want to talk to you because they think you're trying to steal their techniques and sell masks. Even though I tried to tell them I just want to make them for fun, but that's fine. It's kind of, they don't believe me, and I can't say I blame them because it's a very niche kind of thing, so it's fine. So she did all this, and I got to take pictures, which is great because usually if I'm making them, I can't take pictures because I'm covered in goo. So I used a traditional paper mache recipe from one of the older books from period, and it's just wheat flour and water and a little bit of salt to try and prevent mold. I have like this, when I say that mold is not my friend, I have had so many things mold while doing this. It is not even funny. Things that I didn't even know would mold. And I've lost, like I've had many things that I've lost to mold. I had a tricorn hat. I left it in a suitcase for a day with another thing that was slightly wet. Everything in that suitcase had to go. So it happens. There we go. So this is what happens when you try to use olive oil for the release. It didn't work, and it was getting really close to the time I was supposed to teach the making class. And I only had one mold, like one negative to teach. And luckily they were really great about it. And they saw the humor in this too. So the blue is actually the first time I tried to do olive oil. And the second, like, I don't like olives. I don't like olive oil. Nothing about them. Hate everything to do with olives. So the first time I was like, okay, we'll just do it really lightly and it'll be fine. So the second time I like smeared it in olive oil, sprayed it, everything. It was actually worse. So the red is the second one. And then it was so close to the class, I just did Vaseline, and it worked perfectly. And it came out, it just glided out. And that was, so these are all with Vaseline, and it came right out. It's perfect. I was like, okay, well, that's great. But over time, I will not use Vaseline. So this worked out okay. So then I'm adjusting the positive in order to have the eyes be less like bug eyes. And I'm working on a class so that I can teach it in miniature. So when I took the class to Penzic on how to make it, I tried to do it as a 1-part class, which would have been fine, but the electricity at Penzic will not support 3 really low grade hair dryers. And we blew the fuse 3 times, which was not, they were not a fan of us. So I actually did carry 6 molds to Penzic, which one was 32 pounds and the others ranged from 15 to 24. So I took those all to Penzic. Luckily, I live in Buffalo, so I'm only 3 hours from Penzic, but I took them all to Penzic with me in suitcases. I have specific, like I bought rolly cases for them, and only 2 can fit per case. So it's not that bad-ish, maybe. I try to tell myself very quietly. So then that really wasn't my jam. And people were missing out on the actual, like, hey, you could take this home and do it yourself kind of piece. So I've actually changed my idea, and what I will be doing from now on is more like, we're going to make a miniature one from start to finish in 2 different classes. And so I've done, so now we have little eggs that are not quite the size of your face. But I think we're probably going to go even smaller, because the idea of carrying enough clay and plaster of Paris for even this many is kind of maybe a little not as bad as the molds, still not as bad as the molds. But so, like, you can see, you start off, you have to paint all the eggs. So I have to do that ahead of time, because otherwise everything just absorbs into them. But so you start off there, and then you have to like square it off in order to do any of the masks. So this is like the top part. And then they stick really well. So there's like kind of the middle way. And this gets much easier as you do it. But when I first, like, so the very first mask I tried to do was one of these, like the larva. And I could not, the concept of that shape would not stick in my head. And I really had to play with it. It was really hard for me. And when I finally got it, I was super excited. And my cat has been sitting on this one because there's cat fur on it and the nose is not pointy anymore. But then very excitedly, let's see if I can even get this one off. Then I have to take the whole tray up. I actually got this, which looks pretty good and ready to pour. Well, in researching a little bit more and talking to my lovely lady who actually talks about masks with people, they actually don't pour into boxes typically. So like you don't end up with the whole box shape for the pour. They actually usually make the plaster of Paris more dense, and then they basically kind of put it on like a paste almost and make it like a rounded shape over the mask form and use it that way. And that uses a lot less plaster of Paris, and you don't have to carry boxes as an extra thing, unless extra things is good, because I carry a lot of extra things. And then I wanted to show you, this is one of the forms that was created, and it's a little bit flexible. And I haven't, cut out like this is where the bug eyes were kind of weird, and they don't really show you where exactly to cut for the eyes. So that's why I was trying to create like the negative eye space that you see here, because that will show you better where to cut. But two different mask shops in Venice do it differently. So I'm trying this way to see if it's better for cutting. So then here's probably half my bibliography at this point. to be honest, you can kind of see over there that one shelf is pet food, so kind of ignore the top shelf, but the second shelf is all masking. So books that can stand straight and books that have to lie down, and it's all masks and paper mache and what to do with that. And I do have an Instagram that I don't update nearly often enough. I have a WordPress that I also don't update often enough. The email is actually really easy if you want to reach me for almost anything, and I am delighted to share everything. You know, I started out as like but I researched it, and now I'm more of the, if someone else is interested, I'd really love to share and talk about it. So please feel free. That's all information that you can get off of the handouts if you need it. Please feel free to friend me on Instagram. Like I said, I don't update it often enough, but that is my purely SCA Instagram. So unless my animals are doing something like sitting on my masks, they probably won't be on there. So, and that is that. And if anybody would like to ask questions, please feel free. Oh, I didn't run very long today. So some days it runs like super long, some days it doesn't. But if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question or ask a question in the chat, please feel free. Bueller.
I'll maybe stop the recording here.
Perfect.